The municipal water supply tasted wrong 3 weeks before the sky caught fire. I remember this detail because I am Marcus Thane, former sergeant of the 43rd Tertium Guard Regiment, and in 32 years of military service across 17 campaign zones, I learned that wrong-tasting water usually meant someone was dying. Sometimes that someone was you. Sometimes that someone was everyone within 50 kilometers. The specificity of the wrongness mattered less than the fact that trained soldiers noticed such things, catalogued them, reported them through proper channels, and then continued with their assigned duties while waiting to see if anyone in the chain of command considered the information worth acting upon. I had been retired for 6 years when the water started tasting wrong. 6 years of pension credits and veterans' housing on Tertium Majoris. A world that produced enough grain to feed 20 systems, a world where 8 billion souls lived in relative prosperity under the Emperor's benevolent governance. A world where former soldiers could spend their final decades watching grandchildren play in parks maintained by servitors, whose programming ensured the grass remained exactly 7 centimeters in height at all times. The water tasted like metal and something else. Something organic that my training suggested might be biological contamination, but that the local administratum testing facilities assured the population was merely a temporary fluctuation in mineral content due to seasonal variations in groundwater pH levels. The assurances came through official Vox channels with the measured confidence of people reading from approved scripts, their voices carrying that particular tone of bureaucratic certainty that I had learned during my service meant someone somewhere had made calculations about acceptable loss rates and determined that whatever was actually wrong with the water did not justify the expense of fixing it immediately. The population accepted these assurances because populations always accept official assurances when the alternative is acknowledging that the systems they depend upon for survival might be failing, that the authorities they trust to protect them might be lying, that the comfortable reality they inhabit might be a temporary condition subject to revocation without notice or appeal. I filled my canteen from bottled sources and said nothing to my daughter when she visited with my grandchildren because there was nothing to say, no action to recommend, no preparation that would matter if my suspicions were correct, and a great many reasons to avoid alarming a mother of 3 who had never served in the Imperial Guard, and therefore had never learned to recognize the specific taste of a world beginning to die. The second sign came 9 days later when the Arbits started fortifying their precinct stations. I noticed this because my morning walk took me past the central enforcement facility in Hive Tertius, the administrative heart of our continental district where 17 million citizens conducted their daily business under the watchful gaze of the Emperor's lawkeeper. The Arbits normally maintained a presence that was visible but not oppressive, their armored forms standing at intersections like statues carved from ceramite and righteous purpose, their shotguns held in parade rest positions that suggested readiness without explicit threat. Their fortifications began appearing overnight, massive barriers of reinforced plasteel being assembled around the precinct perimeter, heavy weapons emplacements being installed on rooftops, additional personnel in full combat armor replacing the usual patrol rotations. When I passed the precinct that morning, I saw combat servitors being positioned at the main entrance, their weapon arms loaded with ammunition belts that fed into multi-barreled cannons designed for suppressing large-scale civil disturbances. The servitors stood motionless in their alcoves, their organic components still living despite being reduced to biological machinery, their augment eyes scanning the crowds with targeting protocols that would activate if specific threat parameters were met. I had seen similar deployments during the Kelos uprising in my 19th year of service, during the food riots on Praetoris IV in my 27th year, during the cult purge on Sanctum Tertius in my 30th year. Each time the Arbits deployed combat servitors at street level, the death toll within 72 hours measured in thousands. I continued my walk because there was nothing else to do. No authority to report my observations to that did not already know what was happening. No action a retired veteran could take that would alter whatever calculations had determined the combat servitors were necessary. The crowds flowing past the precinct showed no particular concern, the morning commute proceeding with its usual efficiency. Millions of citizens moving through the carefully designed channels that transported them from residential districts to manufactorums and office complexes where their labor would be converted into productivity metrics and economic output. Their lives continued in patterns established through decades of routine, their consciousness occupied by immediate concerns that left no room for existential dread. Their attention focused on personal matters that would cease to matter very shortly. The third sign was the ships. They appeared in orbit on the 15th day, massive vessels that my veteran's eye recognized as warships, despite the official announcements describing them as a naval inspection squadron conducting routine readiness evaluations of the system defense fleet. I watched them through the observation deck of my HAB tower, the southern panoramic viewing port that looked up at the night sky where Tertium Majoris's orbital traffic normally created a predictable pattern of lights moving from horizon to horizon as transport vessels arrived and departed on schedules determined by Administratum Logistics coordinators. The new arrivals did not follow the standard approach vectors, did not maintain the regulation distances from civilian orbital structures, did not broadcast the identification codes that would have allowed the planetary traffic control networks to integrate them into the standard movement patterns. There were 12 ships in the formation that I could identify from ground level. 3 strike cruisers displaying the iconography of the Adeptus Astartes, 4 Imperial Navy battleships of a class I recognized from technical briefings as Retribution-class vessels capable of reducing continents to molten slag through sustained lance battery bombardment. 5 smaller escort craft whose purpose was to screen the larger vessels from fighter attack and provide point defense against incoming ordnance. The formation positioned itself in high orbit directly above our continental cluster, the ships maintaining a geosynchronous position that meant they would remain visible from the same viewing angle regardless of planetary rotation. My daughter visited that evening with my grandchildren, her husband working late at the manufactorium where he supervised the assembly lines that produced agricultural equipment for export to neighboring systems. The children wanted to see the new ships through my viewing port, their excitement untempered by any understanding of what such vessels represented, their young minds interpreting the orbital formation as entertainment rather than judgment. I lifted my granddaughter Elena onto my shoulders so she could see better, her small hands gripping my head for balance, her voice full of wonder as she asked if the ships were here to protect us from aliens or traitors or whatever threats existed in the darkness beyond our world. I told her the Emperor protected us all and changed the subject to whether she wanted hot chocolate, which I prepared using the bottled water because the municipal supply still tasted wrong, and I could not offer my grandchildren anything that might be contaminated with whatever biological agent was being slowly distributed through the planetary aquifer system. We sat together in my small kitchen drinking our chocolate while the ships hung in the sky above us like vast birds of prey, waiting for the appropriate moment to strike. And I did not tell my daughter that I recognized the formation pattern, that I had seen it twice before during my service, that both previous sightings had ended with entire planetary populations being reduced to ash and memory. The announcement came on the 19th day. Every Vox screen in the hive activated simultaneously at local noon, the interruption overriding all scheduled programming and private communications, to display the image of a man whose power armor identified him as a member of the Ordo Xenos, one of the Inquisition's specialized chambers devoted to combating alien threats to the Imperium's survival. He was not young, his face bearing the scars of decades spent in the Emperor's service, his eyes holding the particular emptiness that comes from having seen too many horrors and made too many necessary decisions. He wore the == symbol of the Inquisition on his left pauldron, and his armor showed signs of recent combat, the ceramite plates scorched and dented in patterns that suggested close quarters fighting against enemies equipped with acid weapons or bioplasma. His name was Inquisitor Mordecai, and his voice when he spoke carried the flat authority of someone delivering information that required no discussion or debate. "Citizens of Tertium Majoris," he said, though his expression suggested he was reading from a prepared statement rather than addressing us as individuals worthy of explanation. "Recent investigative actions conducted by agents of the Holy Ordos have confirmed the presence of extensive Genestealer cult infiltration within your planetary population. The contamination has reached levels that preclude conventional containment measures. After consultation with the appropriate Imperial authorities and in accordance with protocols established by the High Lords of Terra, I have authorized Exterminatus action against this world. The sentence will be carried out in 72 hours. May the Emperor have mercy on your souls, because I do not." The screen went dark, the message delivered in less than 30 seconds. The casual announcement of 8 billion deaths, occupying roughly the same amount of time required to order breakfast in a Hab Tower cafeteria. Around me in my small living space, the silence lasted for perhaps 5 seconds before the sounds of screaming began filtering through the walls from neighboring apartments, the noise spreading through the Hab Tower like a virus of its own, panic propagating through the building at the speed of human vocal cords as people absorbed the information and began processing its implications. Genestealer cult infiltration meant that some percentage of the planetary population were not actually human anymore, their genetic structure having been compromised through breeding with xenos organisms that infiltrated human societies over generations, slowly replacing normal births with hybrid offspring who appeared human but carried alien DNA in their cellular structure. The cults operated in secret for decades or centuries, their members hiding among the normal population while slowly increasing their numbers and influence until they achieved critical mass and could summon the Tyrannid hive fleets that would consume every living thing on the planet. The Imperium's response to confirmed Genestealer infiltration was always the same, had to be the same, could only ever be the same. If the infection had spread too far to surgically remove through targeted purges, then the entire planet had to be sterilized, every living thing destroyed, every structure reduced to rubble, every trace of the xenos' taint burned from existence. Exterminatus. The word meant death in High Gothic, though its common usage implied something more comprehensive than simple death, something closer to erasure, to the complete removal of a world from the Imperium's active registry, to the transformation of a living planet into a dead rock that would serve as a warning to future generations about the consequences of allowing alien contamination to take root in human society. I had never witnessed an Exterminatus personally, but I had served with veterans who had been part of planetary evacuation forces before such actions, had heard their stories told in quiet voices during night watches, when old soldiers shared the things they had seen but wished they had not, when men who had fought across 1,000 battlefields admitted to memories that still disrupted their sleep decades later. One veteran, a master sergeant named Hollis, who had served 43 years before taking a last bolt through his spine on Croton Prime, had described watching the orbital bombardment of a hive world consumed by chaos corruption, the surface of the planet burning so brightly that observers in orbit had to use augment filters to avoid retinal damage, the atmospheric ignition creating temperatures that vaporized oceans and cracked tectonic plates. The entire process completed within 6 hours from initial bombardment to confirmed biological extinction. He said the worst part was not the destruction itself, but the silence afterward, the absence of vox traffic from a world that had been home to 12 billion souls, the emptiness where a living planet had existed just hours before. I had asked him if it was necessary, if there had been no other option, if the Imperium truly needed to kill 12 billion people to contain whatever threat had manifested on that world. His answer had been simple and terrible in its certainty. If they had not killed 12 billion people on one world, they would have eventually needed to kill 12 trillion people across 100 worlds after the corruption spread through normal trade routes and refugee movements. The math was straightforward, he said. 12 billion versus 12 trillion. The only people who questioned such calculations were people who did not understand how easily entire sectors could fall to chaos or xenos infiltration once contamination reached critical thresholds. I thought about Master Sergeant Hollis as I stood in my small kitchen listening to the screaming echoing through my hab tower as I calculated the remaining hours until the ships above us would begin their bombardment, as I tried to decide whether I should attempt to reach my daughter or whether any action I might take would merely add pointless suffering to the inevitable conclusion. The Vox screen in my living area activated again, this time showing the planetary governor, a man named Cassius Wren, whose family had ruled Tertium Majoris for 11 generations through combination of political skill and careful management of relationships with imperial authorities. His face showed the strain of recent days, his official robes appearing disheveled, his usually perfect composure broken by obvious fear and grief. "Citizens," he began, then stopped, his throat working as he tried to force words past whatever emotion was choking his voice. "I've been informed by Inquisitor Mordecai that the Genestealer infiltration on our world began approximately 87 years ago, when a mining team encountered a dormant brood in the deep crust. The initial infection was not detected. The miners returned to surface facilities carrying genetic contamination in their cellular structure, and from that first point of contact, the cult spread through normal reproductive patterns across 3 generations of our population." He paused again, his eyes dropping to whatever notes or displays were positioned below the camera recording his statement. "The Inquisition's investigation indicates that approximately 43% of our current population shows genetic markers consistent with hybrid status. Another 12% shows evidence of cult indoctrination without genetic alteration, and the remaining 45% are uninfected, but have had sufficient contact with hybrid population members that containment through conventional means is deemed impossible. The genetic corruption has reached the highest levels of our governmental and military structures. I myself have been tested and confirmed as pure human, but my wife and 2 of my 3 children carry the taint. I do not know which of my children are human and which are monsters wearing human faces." The admission broke something in his composure, his shoulders sagging as he leaned against whatever desk or podium was supporting him off-camera. "The Exterminatus order is justified according to all established protocols," he said, his voice barely audible. "The threat is real. The infiltration is complete. The consequences of allowing this world to continue existing could be catastrophic on a sector-wide scale. I have reviewed the evidence personally. I have consulted with senior administrative officials. I have prayed to the Emperor for guidance and mercy. There is no alternative. Tertium Majoris must die so that humanity might live." What followed was a formal reading of the Exterminatus decree, the legal justification for genocide delivered in the precise language of imperial law, each clause carefully structured to demonstrate that all appropriate procedures had been followed, all necessary consultations completed, all required authorizations obtained. Governor Wren read through the document with mechanical precision, his voice steady despite the tears running down his face, his training allowing him to perform his final official duty, even as that duty required him to announce the death of his entire world, including his own corrupted family members. The decree concluded with the standard formula about the Emperor's judgment being final and absolute, about the necessity of sacrifice in service to humanity's survival, about how those who died in the upcoming bombardment would be giving their lives to prevent the spread of xenos corruption across the Imperium. Then Governor Wren looked directly into the camera recording his statement and said something that wasn't part of the official formula, something personal and true and terrible. "We die so that you might live. Remember that when you hear about Tertium Majoris." Remember that 8 billion people are being killed not because they were evil, but because the Imperium cannot afford mercy when extinction is the alternative. Remember us. Please. Someone should remember." The transmission ended. The screaming in the Hab Tower intensified as the reality of our situation penetrated even the most determined denial, as 8 billion people simultaneously confronted their impending deaths, as social order began its final collapse in the face of absolute certainty about the immediate future. I walked to my viewing port and looked up at the orbital formation still hanging motionless against the stars. Those 12 ships that would shortly deliver the Emperor's judgment upon our world. Those vessels filled with crew members who would return to their bunks after completing their bombardment mission and sleep without particular concern about the deaths they had caused, because from their perspective, they would merely be following legitimate orders in service to the Imperium's survival. The first riots began within 3 hours of Governor Wren's announcement. I watched from my Hab Tower as crowds surged through the streets below, their movements displaying the particular patterns of mass panic that I had witnessed during civil disturbances on other worlds. The combination of fear and rage and desperate hope that physical action might somehow alter an unchangeable situation. The mobs attacked Arbite stations first, as they always did. The crowd's fury directed at the most visible symbols of authority that had condemned them to death. The Arbites responded with lethal force, as they were trained to do, their shotguns and shock mauls and combat servitors cutting into the crowds with mechanical efficiency, the bodies falling in windows that demonstrated precise fire discipline and proper ammunition conservation. The crowds kept coming anyway because they had nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. No alternative except waiting quietly for death, and most human beings find it impossible to wait quietly for death, even when resistance is objectively futile. The Arbites killed thousands in the first hour, tens of thousands in the second hour, hundreds of thousands by the end of the first day. The bodies accumulated in the streets where they fell, the normal civic services that would have collected them having ceased operation when the personnel assigned to those services decided to spend their final hours with families or in prayer or in whatever activities they considered more important than maintaining sanitation protocols for a city that would cease to exist within 72 hours. My Vox screen activated again, this time showing a junior administrative official whose name I did not recognize, attempting to establish some form of order by announcing the locations of designated civilian assembly areas where uncontaminated citizens could gather to await genetic screening and possible evacuation. The announcement was technically accurate in that genetic screening protocols were indeed being implemented, but the official failed to mention that even confirmed pure humans would not be evacuated because the number of available transport ships was nowhere near sufficient to carry the 45% of the population that tested negative for genestealer contamination, and because the Inquisition had determined that exposure-based risk meant that even uninfected individuals might carry dormant cult indoctrination or psychological compromise that could manifest in future years. The entire population would die, infected and uninfected alike, because the Imperium's calculations determined that was the only way to guarantee complete elimination of the genestealer threat. I did not go to the assembly areas, did not present myself for genetic screening, did not participate in any of the organized activities that the planetary government was attempting to maintain, despite knowing that participation was ultimately meaningless. Instead, I filled several containers with bottled water that no longer tasted wrong, because the wrongness of the water was now the least important problem facing Tertium Majoris, and I prepared to wait out the 72 hours in my small Hab unit rather than risk being crushed in the riots or shot by Arbites or exposed to whatever airborne pathogens might be spreading through the crowded assembly areas where desperate people gathered in the false hope that cooperation might somehow save them. On the second day after the announcement, I received a Vox message from my daughter. She had attempted to reach the starport with her children and husband, hoping to secure passage on one of the civilian transports that were rumored to be accepting evacuees, despite the official prohibition against off-world travel. The attempt had failed because the starport had been sealed by Imperial Guard units who were under orders to prevent any ships from leaving the surface until the Exterminatus was completed, the quarantine being absolute to prevent any potentially infected individuals from escaping and spreading the genetic taint to other worlds. Her husband had been shot when he attempted to force his way through the guard cordon, the last round entering his chest and cooking his internal organs before he fell. And she had run with the children back to their Heb unit in the lower city, where they were now sheltering while the riots intensified around them. Her message was brief, her voice calm despite the circumstances, her words chosen with care because she knew I was receiving this information and wanted me to understand that she was not panicking, not losing control, not requiring me to attempt some futile rescue mission that would merely result in my death alongside hers. She told me she loved me, that the children loved their grandfather, that she was proud to be my daughter and hoped I was proud of her. She told me she had explained to Elena and her brothers what was happening in terms simple enough for children to grasp, had told them they were going to see the Emperor soon, that death was nothing to fear because the Emperor protected his faithful, that their father had died bravely and they should remember him that way. Then she said something that confirmed she was indeed my daughter, that my training and experience had been passed down through example, even though she had never served in the Guard. She said she had checked the municipal water supply records through her work terminal at the Administratum facility where she processed agricultural export licenses, had noticed the anomalous readings beginning 3 weeks before the official announcement, had cross-referenced those readings with known biological contamination patterns, and realized that someone had been distributing something through the water system, probably a testing agent designed to activate genetic markers in hybrid population members so they could be identified and tracked before the final purge. The Inquisition had known about the genestealer infiltration for at least 3 weeks, she said. Probably much longer, possibly for years or decades. They had been observing the cult's development, mapping its organizational structures, identifying its leadership and breeding facilities, gathering comprehensive intelligence while the infection spread through more and more of the population. The water testing had been the final step before implementation of Exterminatus protocols, the method by which they could confirm the percentage of genetic contamination and determine whether conventional purging was feasible or whether the entire planet needed to be sterilized. "We were bait," she said, her voice still calm, still controlled, still maintaining the discipline I had taught her through years of living with a father who understood that the Imperium's survival required calculations that individual humans found difficult to accept. They let the cult spread so they could study it, understand it, develop better countermeasures for future infiltrations. They sacrificed Tertium Majoris to gather data that might save other worlds. The math is sound. 8 billion deaths to prevent 80 billion deaths on 10 worlds, 20 years from now. I understand the calculation even though I hate it. The message ended with her telling me she was going to give the children their favorite meal for dinner, that she was going to hold them while they slept, that she was grateful I had raised her to understand that duty and love could exist simultaneously even when duty required terrible things. She did not ask me to respond, did not request confirmation that I was safe, did not suggest we should attempt to meet before the end. She understood, as I did, that the final hours were best spent in whatever small comforts remained rather than exhausting energy on futile actions. I stood in my small kitchen after her message ended and allowed myself the first tears I'd shed since my wife died 8 years earlier. Allowed myself to grieve for my daughter and my grandchildren and my dead son-in-law and the 8 billion other souls who would shortly cease to exist. Allowed myself to feel the weight of understanding that my daughter had grasped the truth about our situation and responded with calmness and dignity and appropriate prioritization of her children's final experiences over her own fear and rage. Then I stopped crying because tears served no purpose, and I had approximately 48 hours remaining before the bombardment began, and I wanted to spend those hours remembering the good parts of my life rather than fixating on its ending. The third day brought a change in the orbital formation. I noticed it during my morning observation period, when I looked through the viewing port and saw that the ships had adjusted their positions, the strike cruisers moving to slightly higher orbit, while the battleships descended to optimal bombardment altitude. The movement was subtle enough that most civilians would not have recognized its significance. But I had spent 3 decades learning to read battlefield positioning, and the new formation indicated that final preparations were underway, targeting solutions being calculated, weapons systems being brought online and loaded with ordnance appropriate for planetary sterilization. The riots had mostly subsided by the third day, not because order had been restored, but because the rioters had exhausted themselves through violence that achieved nothing, and now faced their final hours with no energy remaining for futile resistance. The streets below my hab tower were littered with corpses that no one was collecting, the bodies bloating in the sun, while carrion birds that had somehow survived the chaos began feeding on the remains. The Arbites had withdrawn to their fortified positions after determining that maintaining public order was no longer a priority, given the imminent annihilation of the entire public. Their combat servitors powered down to conserve energy that would not be needed because there would shortly be no one left to suppress. My Vox screen activated periodically with automated messages from various Imperial authorities. The recordings delivering information about shelter protocols and genetic screening procedures and emergency supply distribution, as if such concerns remained relevant in a world that would cease to exist within 24 hours. The messages continued broadcasting because the systems generating them were automated and would continue operating until the bombardment destroyed the transmitters and receivers and everything else on the planetary surface. The machines faithfully performing their programming, even after the humans who created them had given up any pretense of meaningful activity. I spent the third day writing a final message on my personal data slate, organizing my thoughts about what I had witnessed and experienced during my 71 years of life, attempting to create some record of Marcus Thane's existence that might survive the Exterminatus, even though I understood intellectually that such survival was impossible, that the bombardment would be comprehensive enough to destroy not just living things but infrastructure and records and any physical evidence that Tertium Majoris had ever been home to 8 billion human souls. I wrote anyway because writing gave me something to do besides waiting for death, because the act of organizing my thoughts provided structure to my final hours, because some part of my consciousness insisted on believing that words had value even when no one would ever read them. I wrote about my service in the 43rd Guard, the campaigns I had fought across 17 worlds, the soldiers I had commanded and the enemies I had killed, and the moments of fear and courage and boredom and camaraderie that defined military life. I wrote about my wife and how we had met during my leave period on Sanctum Tertius when I was 29, and she was working in a medical facility treating wounded guard personnel, how she had agreed to marry a soldier despite knowing that soldiers died young and violently more often than they died old and comfortable. I wrote about my daughter, and how proud I was that she had inherited my capacity for clear thinking under pressure, my ability to prioritize duty over emotion while still maintaining the emotional connections that made duty meaningful rather than merely mechanical. I wrote about Tertium Majoris and how good it had been to live here during my retirement years, how the parks were beautiful and the food was excellent and the people were generally kind to each other in the small daily interactions that comprised civilian life. I wrote about my grandchildren and their questions about the orbital ships, and how I had lied to them because children should not have to understand that the Imperium they served was preparing to kill them as part of rational calculations about acceptable loss rates in service to humanity's larger survival. When I finished writing, approximately 6 hours remained before the bombardment would begin, according to the countdown that someone had helpfully programmed into my Vox screen's display, the numbers updating every second to show exactly how much time remained before 8 billion people would start dying. I saved the document to my data slate's permanent storage, even though permanent was now a relative term measured in hours, rather than years or decades. Then I sat in my small living area and looked through my viewing port at the ships hanging above us like the swords of ancient terror myths, suspended in the moment before they fell, beautiful and terrible in their purpose. The orbital bombardment began at exactly the time specified in the countdown, the punctuality demonstrating that the Imperial Navy understood that if you were going to kill 8 billion people, you should at least have the decency to do it on schedule. The first indication was light, not sound, because light traveled faster than sound, and the viewing port I was watching through gave me a clear line of sight to the northern continent where the initial strikes were landing. The northern continent was home to approximately 1 billion people spread across 15 major hive cities and thousands of smaller settlements, all of which began burning simultaneously as lance strikes from the battleships reached down through the atmosphere with beams of focused energy that struck the surface with temperatures measured in millions of degrees. The lance batteries were designed for ship-to-ship combat, capable of punching through meters of armored hull plating, and when deployed against planetary targets, they produced effects that transcended normal human experience of destruction. The hive cities began to burn, not with normal fire, but with thermal radiation so intense that the structures themselves vaporized before flames could develop, entire buildings ceasing to exist as solid matter and becoming expanding clouds of superheated plasma that rose into the atmosphere in mushroom-shaped columns, visible from thousands of kilometers away. The strikes continued in precise patterns, the targeting solutions designed to ensure complete coverage of population centers and industrial facilities and agricultural zones and anything else that might harbor surviving organisms or cult structures or genetic material that could regenerate the infection. I watched through my viewing port as the northern continent died, as 1 billion people ceased to exist over the course of approximately 40 minutes. Their deaths occurring so quickly that most of them probably never understood what was happening. The neural signals that would have communicated pain or fear, unable to complete their journey to consciousness before the tissues generating those signals were vaporized by temperatures that exceeded the surface of our system's star. It was, I supposed, a mercy, though the Imperium's willingness to grant even that small mercy suggested that someone in the command structure possessed residual humanity despite the necessity of their actions. Then the sound arrived, delayed by the distance and the speed of atmospheric transmission, a continuous roaring thunder that suggested the sky itself was tearing apart, the acoustic energy generated by the lance strikes creating pressure waves that rattled the windows of my hab tower, despite being filtered through hundreds of kilometers of atmosphere. The sound continued without pause as the bombardment expanded to other continental clusters, the fleet systematically working through targeting lists that ensured no population center would be missed, no refuge overlooked, no possibility of survival permitted. My Vox screen activated again, this time showing the interior of what appeared to be a planetary defense bunker where Governor Wren and several senior officials had gathered to await their deaths with whatever dignity could be maintained in such circumstances. The governor looked older than he had during his previous broadcast, the accumulated stress of the past 72 hours visible in his face, but he spoke with the same formal precision that had characterized his earlier announcements. Citizens who remain capable of receiving this transmission, he said, though I suspected the number of people still watching Vox screens was minimal, given that most hab towers had lost power as the bombardment damaged electrical infrastructure, and most people had better things to do than watch official broadcasts during their final minutes of life. The orbital bombardment will continue for approximately 6 hours until all surface structures have been reduced to acceptable levels of destruction. Following the bombardment, the fleet will deploy specialized weapons designed to ensure complete biological extinction. He paused, his eyes scanning some document positioned below the camera's view. I've been informed by Inquisitor Mordecai that the specialized weapons are classified as virus bombs, devices containing genetically engineered pathogens that will spread through the atmosphere and eliminate all remaining organic life regardless of location or protective measures. The pathogen is designed to work quickly, to cause minimal suffering, to complete its function within minutes of exposure. Death will be certain and relatively painless for those who survive the initial bombardment. Another pause, longer this time, his throat working as he tried to maintain composure. I will remain at this command post until the virus deployment commences, at which point this facility's environmental systems will fail and the pathogen will reach us as it reaches all other survivors. My staff and I will die performing our duties, maintaining what order we can until the end, serving the Emperor as we have served him throughout our lives. I ask those of you who hear these words to forgive me for failing to protect you, for allowing the Genestealer infiltration to spread undetected, for not recognizing the signs before the infection reached levels that required this final solution. The transmission ended abruptly, the signal cutting off as power failed to the bunker's broadcast equipment. Or perhaps as Governor Wren decided he had said everything worth saying and preferred to spend his final moments in private rather than performing for cameras that would shortly be destroyed along with everything else on Tertium Majoris. The bombardment continued for another 5 hours, the lance strikes supplemented by conventional ordnance as the fleet worked through its targeting lists, cyclonic torpedoes being deployed against particularly hardened structures that required more than directed energy to destroy completely. The torpedoes were massive weapons, each one containing enough explosive force to destroy a large city, and they fell from orbit in sequences that created overlapping blast radii designed to ensure nothing survived within the target zones. I watched as my own continental cluster came under bombardment, the southern hive cities beginning to burn one by one as the fleet's targeting solutions reached our portion of the planetary surface. The explosions moved closer to Hive Tertius in a pattern that suggested the targeting teams were working methodically through some predetermined sequence, each strike creating a fireball that rose several kilometers into the atmosphere before dissipating, each explosion generating an earthquake that I could feel through my Hab Tower's structure as shock waves propagated through the planetary crust. The building swayed with each impact, the construction designed to withstand seismic events, but not seismic events of this magnitude occurring in rapid succession, the structural integrity degrading as the bombardment stressed the Hab Tower's foundation beyond the tolerance parameters the architects had calculated during its construction 300 years earlier. I remained by my viewing port because there was nowhere else to go and no point in seeking shelter from destruction that would shortly be comprehensive, regardless of location. Other residents of the Hab Tower had apparently reached similar conclusions because I could hear voices through the walls, people saying goodbye to each other, families praying together, individuals making peace with whatever beliefs provided them comfort in their final moments. Some of the voices were calm, others were screaming. Most fell somewhere between those extremes, the full range of human responses to impending death playing out simultaneously in the confined spaces where people had lived their lives before those lives were scheduled for termination. The targeting solution for Hive Tertius was executed in stages, smaller strikes destroying the outlying districts first before the major weapons targeted the central spire, where the highest concentration of population and infrastructure demanded maximum destructive force. I watched through my viewing port as districts I'd walked through during my retirement years ceased to exist. The buildings and streets and parks and everything else simply vanishing in flashes of light too bright to look at directly, replaced by expanding fireballs that consumed oxygen and life and hope with equal efficiency. Then the central spire's turn came, and I felt the impact through every atom of my body as a cyclonic torpedo detonated somewhere below my hab tower, the explosion creating a pressure wave that traveled up through the structure with sufficient force to lift me off my feet despite being hundreds of levels above the impact point. The tower began to collapse, the lower levels failing first and allowing the upper sections to drop straight down in a controlled demolition that was ironic, given that no one had intended the collapse to be controlled. I had perhaps 2 seconds to recognize what was happening before my viewing port shattered and the external wall of my hab unit broke away, and I was falling through open air alongside pieces of my home and pieces of my neighbors and pieces of the building that had sheltered 17 million people who are now all dying together in one final communal act. The fall lasted longer than I expected, the sensation of weightlessness creating a strange calmness as I tumbled through space, my body rotating so that I could see both the ground rushing up toward me and the sky above where the ships still hung in perfect formation, their work not yet complete, their mission requiring more than just bombardment to ensure the absolute biological extinction that Exterminatus protocols demanded. I thought about my daughter and my grandchildren and whether they had died quickly or whether they were still alive somewhere in the ruins waiting for the virus bombs that Governor Wren had mentioned. I thought about Master Sergeant Hollis and his description of the orbital bombardment he had witnessed decades earlier, his voice quiet as he explained that the worst part was not the destruction, but the silence afterward. I thought about the Imperium and its calculations, and whether the math really justified killing 8 billion people, or whether the math was simply a way to make genocide feel rational, rather than monstrous. Then I stopped thinking because I hit the ground, and my body ceased functioning in the manner required to support consciousness, the impact destroying enough neural tissue that whatever electrical patterns comprised Marcus Thane's identity could no longer maintain cohesion. My final thought, incomplete as organic machinery failed, and existence became a theoretical concept rather than an experiential reality. But death was not the end of the Exterminatus, merely the end of my personal observation of its implementation, and what followed my termination required documentation even though I was no longer capable of providing it. The virus bombs deployed 6 hours after the orbital bombardment began, at which point approximately 30% of the planetary population had already been killed by direct bombardment, or structural collapse or fires that spread through hab towers, whose environmental systems had failed. The remaining 70%, approximately 5 billion people, were about to experience the second stage of the Exterminatus protocol, the biological component designed to ensure that no organism survived regardless of location or protective measures. The bombs themselves were unremarkable in appearance, simple cylinders launched from the fleet's bombardment vessels and released at high altitude where atmospheric currents could distribute their contents across maximum surface area. Each bomb contained approximately 1,000 liters of concentrated life-eater virus suspended in an aerosol carrier designed to remain airborne for extended periods, while wind patterns spread the pathogen across continents and oceans. The virus itself was a miracle of genetic engineering, a pathogen specifically designed to attack the basic cellular structures common to all organic life. The weapon that made Exterminatus practical because it could achieve in minutes what conventional bombardment would require days or weeks to accomplish. The bombs dispersed their contents in clouds that appeared almost beautiful from orbit, delicate veils of gray mist that spread through the atmosphere like watercolor on canvas, the aesthetic quality of the deployment providing strange contrast to the function being performed. The aerosol reached ground level approximately 15 minutes after deployment, the first deaths occurring in the open areas where people had fled the bombardment or where hab tower collapses had exposed survivors to the external atmosphere. The life-eater virus killed through a process called cellular lysis, a catastrophic failure of cell membrane integrity that caused individual cells to rupture and spill their contents into surrounding tissue. The effect began at the molecular level, but quickly scaled up to the macro level as billions of cells failed simultaneously, the organism's structural integrity collapsing from within as the biochemical mechanisms that maintained life ceased functioning. The process was extremely painful for those who remained conscious long enough to experience it. The sensation reportedly similar to being burned alive from the inside, nerve endings firing distress signals until the neurons themselves lysed and ceased generating signals altogether. The people who died in those first minutes were the fortunate ones, their exposure to high concentrations of the virus producing death within 60 to 90 seconds, fast enough that consciousness usually ended before the pain became unbearable. Those in sheltered locations with partial environmental protection experienced longer exposure periods and correspondingly longer death sequences, minutes instead of seconds, their bodies dissolving gradually as the virus worked through their cellular structures from external surfaces inward toward protected organs. The virus spread through the atmosphere with exponential efficiency. The winds that normally brought pleasant weather to Tertium Majoris, now carrying death to every corner of the planet. The pathogen reaching even remote settlements and underground facilities whose inhabitants had hoped that distance or depth might provide protection from bombardment. The environmental seals that normally protected hab towers and industrial complexes from atmospheric contamination were designed to filter out particulate matter and gaseous pollutants, not military-grade biological weapons that operated at the molecular level and could penetrate even the smallest gaps in supposedly sealed systems. Governor Wren died in his command bunker when the environmental systems failed, the filters becoming saturated with viral particles that gradually infiltrated the structure's internal atmosphere until the concentration reached lethal levels. He was found later, after the Imperium sent investigation teams to confirm the Exterminatus had been completed successfully, his body reduced to blackened biological slurry that bore little resemblance to anything that had once been human. The official report noted that he appeared to have died at his post, his position suggesting he remained seated at his command station until the virus rendered him incapable of maintaining posture. My daughter died in her hab unit with her children, the three of them lying together on her sleeping platform where she had held them during their final hours. The virus reached them through the ventilation system, the hab unit's environmental controls having failed during the bombardment when power distribution networks suffered catastrophic damage. The investigation teams that later catalogued the casualties noted that she appeared to have maintained protective positions around her children until the end, her arms still wrapped around bodies that had liquefied into organic residue that bore genetic markers, identifying them as her offspring, but showed no other identifying characteristics. The virus bombs killed 5 billion people within 3 hours of deployment, the remaining population having already died during the orbital bombardment or in the subsequent structural collapses and fires that followed. The pathogen then continued spreading through the ecosystem, attacking plant life and animal life and bacterial life and every other biological entity that might have survived the bombardment, reducing forests to contaminated sludge and converting oceans into biological waste products and ensuring that no organism capable of harboring genestealer genetic material could possibly remain viable. The Life-Eater virus had one additional characteristic that made it the preferred weapon for Exterminatus operations, a characteristic that Governor Wren had mentioned during his final broadcast, but had not fully explained because the technical details would have been meaningless to people facing imminent death. As the virus consumed organic matter and caused cellular lysis, the decomposition process released significant quantities of methane gas as a byproduct of the biochemical reactions occurring within dead tissue. The methane accumulated in the atmosphere at concentrations that quickly exceeded combustibility thresholds, transforming Tertium Majoris's oxygen-rich atmosphere into a planetary-scale fuel-air bomb waiting for ignition. The ignition came 20 hours after the virus deployment, plenty of time for the methane to reach sufficient concentration while the pathogen completed its work, eliminating any survivors who might have found temporary refuge in isolated locations. The ignition source was provided by lance strikes from the orbital fleet, precisely calculated energy beams that touched the methane-saturated atmosphere at multiple points simultaneously, the thermal energy providing the activation energy required to begin combustion that would then spread through chain reaction across the entire planetary atmosphere. The result was called a firestorm, though that simple term failed to capture the magnitude of what occurred when an entire planet's atmosphere ignited simultaneously. The combustion generated temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius at ground level, sustained heat sufficient to melt rock and vaporize remaining liquid water and complete the sterilization process that the virus had begun. The firestorm consumed all remaining oxygen in a matter of hours, the atmospheric composition shifting from breathable mixture to carbon dioxide and nitrogen and trace gases incapable of supporting any known form of life. The fleet maintained observation as tertium majoris burned, sensors monitoring atmospheric composition and surface temperature and electromagnetic spectrum signatures that might indicate surviving power sources or communication systems or any other evidence that biological or technological activity continued somewhere on the ravaged surface. The monitoring continued for 72 hours, the same duration as the warning period between announcement and implementation, a symmetry that suggested someone in the planning process had recognized the ironic parallel. At the end of 72 hours, Inquisitor Mordecai transmitted his final report to the appropriate Imperial authorities, the document confirming that all objectives had been achieved according to established protocols, that the genestealer threat had been neutralized, that tertium majoris no longer represented a danger to surrounding Imperial territories. The report noted that total casualties were estimated at 8 billion souls, the figure representing the planet's last confirmed census before the Exterminatus, and recommended that the world be reclassified as a dead world and placed under permanent quarantine to prevent accidental recolonization or unauthorized salvage operations. The fleet departed the system shortly after Inquisitor Mordecai filed his report, the ships breaking orbit and transitioning to warp travel toward their next assignments, whatever duties awaited them in the endless grinding conflict that defined the Imperium's existence. The crews returned to their normal routines, the bombardment specialists reviewing what lessons could be learned from the operation, the weapon technicians performing maintenance on lance batteries and torpedo tubes, the command officers updating tactical databases with information about execution times and resource expenditures and efficiency metrics that would inform future Exterminatus operations. Some of the younger crew members expressed distress about the operation, their psychological conditioning not yet comprehensive enough to completely suppress normal human responses to mass death, their consciousnesses struggling to process the fact that they had participated in killing 8 billion people over the course of 24 hours. The older crew members provided what counseling they could, explaining that the death of 8 billion on one world might prevent the death of 80 billion on 10 worlds, that the Imperium's survival required such calculations, that regret was acceptable but doubt was heresy, because doubting the necessity of Exterminatus meant questioning the authorities who ordered it, and questioning authority meant walking the path toward corruption and damnation. Most of the young crew members accepted this counseling and integrated the experience into their understanding of what duty required in service to the Emperor, their psychological defense mechanisms engaging to protect them from trauma that could compromise their effectiveness in future operations. A few could not accept it, could not reconcile their actions with their remaining humanity, could not continue functioning as weapons technicians or bombardment specialists or whatever roles had placed them in direct participation in the deaths of billions. These few were quietly transferred to other duties or granted medical discharges, or in some cases simply disappeared from crew rosters after private consultations with commissars, who determined they represented security risks due to their inability to maintain psychological stability. The Imperium did not comment publicly on the Exterminatus of Tertium Majoris because the Imperium did not comment publicly on most Exterminatus operations, the policy being that such announcements would only generate unnecessary questions and potentially undermine civilian confidence in the authorities responsible for defending humanity's survival. The world simply ceased to appear in shipping schedules and trade agreements and census records. Its 8 billion inhabitants deleted from administrative databases, with the same casual efficiency used to delete obsolete inventory records or expired contracts. Neighboring systems were informed through classified channels that Tertium Majoris had been lost to xenos activity and would no longer be available for trade or refugee settlement or any other purposes. The explanation technically accurate, while omitting details about how exactly the world had been lost and who had been responsible for that loss. The systems adjusted their economic planning accordingly, redirecting agricultural imports to alternative sources and modifying population distribution plans to account for the missing capacity that Tertium Majoris had previously provided. Within 6 months, the economic disruption had been absorbed by the regional trade networks, the 8 billion deaths producing no lasting impact on the sector's overall functionality. Several years after the Exterminatus, an Administratum Surveyor team visited Tertium Majoris to confirm that the quarantine protocols were being properly maintained and that no unauthorized activity had occurred on the dead world. The team found a planet whose surface had been reduced to bare rock and cooling magma, the atmospheric pressure having dropped to approximately 10% of pre-bombardment levels, the remaining gases consisting primarily of carbon dioxide with trace amounts of nitrogen and methane that continued off-gassing from decaying organic residue buried beneath the surface. The temperature remained elevated 40 degrees above normal background levels, the planetary heat budget still dissipating the excess energy introduced during the firestorm. The survey team detected no electromagnetic emissions that would indicate surviving technology, no thermal signatures that would suggest biological activity, no evidence of any kind that the world had once supported 8 billion human souls and the infrastructure required to maintain that population. The cities had been reduced to rubble that subsequent geological processes were already beginning to bury, beneath wind-blown debris and volcanic ash from the destabilized tectonic system. The agricultural zones that had once fed 20 systems had been thoroughly incinerated, the soil transformed into inert minerals incapable of supporting plant growth even if atmospheric conditions had been suitable. The team's final report recommended that quarantine status be maintained indefinitely, noting that the planet showed no signs of biological recovery and likely would not recover for several thousand years, even if recolonization efforts were attempted. The report concluded with standard language about the world, serving as an example of the Imperium's resolve in confronting xenos threats, and recommended that navigation warnings remain active to ensure passing ships understood they were prohibited from approaching or landing on the surface under penalty of death. Among the 8 billion casualties of the Exterminatus was a significant number of pure-strain humans who had never been infected by genestealer genetic material, never participated in cult activities, never represented any threat to the Imperium's stability or humanity's survival. These people died because they had the misfortune to live on a world where 43% of the population carried xenos contamination. Their deaths deemed necessary because the Imperium's calculations determined that the cost of identifying and separating the uninfected from the infected exceeded the value of preserving those innocent lives. The math was straightforward from the Imperium's perspective. Genetic screening of 5 billion people would require approximately 8 million man-hours of medical personnel time, would demand specialized equipment that was needed for other critical functions in the sector, would risk exposure of screening personnel to cult indoctrination techniques that might compromise their loyalty, and would ultimately save only 45% of the population while leaving the infrastructure and ecosystem thoroughly contaminated with genestialer genetic material that could resurge from even small surviving hybrid populations. The alternative was comprehensive Exterminatus that required approximately 50,000 man-hours of fleet operations time and produced guaranteed results with zero risk of resurgent infection. 8 million man-hours versus 50,000. Man-hours, 45% survival with significant residual risk versus 0% survival with zero residual risk. The imperial authorities who reviewed the situation selected the second option because the second option was objectively superior according to every metric that mattered for galactic-scale strategic planning. And the fact that the second option required killing several billion innocent people was unfortunate but ultimately irrelevant to the calculations. This was the truth of the Imperium's survival strategy. The cold mathematics that defined humanity's response to existential threats in a galaxy filled with entities that wanted to destroy or enslave or consume the human species. Individual lives had no value in such calculations except as they contributed to species survival. Individual suffering had no weight except as it might indicate system failures that compromised military effectiveness. Individual deaths meant nothing except as they accumulated into statistics that could be analyzed for efficiency and cost-benefit optimization. Marcus Thane had understood this during his 32 years of military service, had participated in operations where millions died so that billions might live, had made decisions that resulted in deaths he could have prevented but chose not to because preventing those deaths would have compromised mission objectives. His daughter had understood this when she analyzed the water contamination data and recognized what was happening. Her training in administrative procedures giving her the framework to comprehend that her world was being deliberately sacrificed as part of larger strategic calculations. Governor Wren had understood this when he read the Exterminatus decree and explained to his population that they were dying so that others might live. His aristocratic education having prepared him to grasp the brutal logic that governed the Imperium's survival. Most of Tertium, Majoris's 8 billion inhabitants, had not understood this, their civilian perspectives lacking the context necessary to comprehend why the Imperium would kill them rather than attempt rescue, why their loyalty and faith meant nothing when measured against threat assessment protocols and resource allocation matrices. They died, confused and angry and betrayed, their final thoughts filled with questions about why the emperor they had worshipped their entire lives had abandoned them, why the authorities they had trusted to protect them had instead condemned them to death, why the Imperium they served with such devotion would treat them as expendable components rather than valued citizens. The answer to those questions was simple, though most civilians never learned it during their lifetimes. The Emperor did not protect individuals. The authorities existed to serve the Imperium rather than its citizens, and devotion meant nothing compared to strategic value when extinction was the alternative to ruthless pragmatism. This was the foundation of the Imperium's survival across 10,000 years and 10,000 worlds, the dark truth that sustained humanity's continued existence in the grim darkness of the far future, where mercy was weakness and compassion was heresy, and the only virtue that mattered was the willingness to sacrifice anything for the species' survival. Tertium Majoris burned and died and was forgotten, its 8 billion souls becoming statistics in classified reports that would be sealed in inquisitorial archives for 10,000 years. Their names never recorded, their lives never commemorated, their deaths never mourned except by the few family members or friends who survived on other worlds and gradually learned through unofficial channels that the planet had been lost. The Imperium continued without pause, its vast machinery grinding forward through time and space, consuming worlds and populations and entire civilizations in its endless struggle against the darkness that threatened to overwhelm humanity's fragile existence. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are only necessary sacrifices. Tertium Majoris was one of thousands. It will not be the last.